Hi, Mortpig here. Another video of our life is in Australia. As you can imagine, what is dominating everything right now is the Australian housing market. Here we have a video from Leith van Onselen, who is the chief economist of Macro Business, which he is a co-founder of. He is his whole working life right now is looking at the economy. He's very critical of the Australian housing market. Here he is in an interview talking about something he's wrote, Labor lights match under Australian housing market. I think he's referring to the new 5% deposit. Let's start the video.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm okay. I saw this story and I thought immediately, I bet you've got a comment about this with Labor lighting the match under the house prices. Where are you at with it?
Yeah, that's right, mate. This is, par for the course in Australia, unfortunately. So, according to Cotality, so they used to be known as CoreLogic. They're basically one of the major housing data providers in Australia. They valued Australia's housing at an average of 1,020,000. So that's one.
Like, it's good if you own a home, even with or without a mortgage. It's good if you've owned a home and you've actually paid off your mortgage. Older Australians, this would be definitely the case. For them, this really doesn't affect them, but people looking to get into the market, going to be first home buyers, going to be very tough when the average house in Australia is $1 million. Just think about that, what it takes in your working life on the wage with all the other costs of living. Save that deposit, even at 5%, to buy $1 million home. And if you can't afford the deposit, that $50K, $1 million home, you're taking on a mortgage of $950,000. Plus, you'll be paying interest on that, would be probably the cost of the loan at the start. So pay off $950 in principal and potentially $950 in interest payments. Oh, that's painful.
1,020,000 for every house, apartment, bed sit across the nation. It's an incredibly, expensive, extraordinary figure when you think about over $1 million just to buy an average home in Australia.
Yeah.
And it's made Australia basically one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. And, Australia's housing stock is valued at about...
Well, for me, I bought my first home in my 20s, over 20 years ago, and I think I bought it at the top of the market then. It was 400,000 in inner city Brisbane. 420 was the price, but I paid like a 20% deposit at the time. So my loan was actually like 300,000, and within the life of that loan, my wage at the time easily covered the repayments, and I could live off and save. Whereas if you're looking at a $900,000 loan, your minimum weeklies are going to be $1,300 a month. Sorry, a week. A week. Who can afford this?
About 400,000 per capita in March this year, and that's in...
Like, I understand, like, people who have done well for themselves, that's perfectly okay. You've created a business, you've generated wealth through a business, and been able to go up the rungs and maybe have a multi-million-dollar home. That's all good. I guess it's just that affordability on the lower end now is just what life will you be leading paying off this mortgage with an average wage?
real terms, that's once you adjust for inflation, it's more than tripled in value in the last 30 years. So we've had this, absolutely ginormous 30-year housing boom in the nation that has, obviously driven the average home value over $1 million. And notionally, at least, it's made Australians some of the wealthiest people on earth. So the latest UBS Global Wealth Report came out last month.
Well, this is it. Like, you can be own $1 million home, maybe $2 million home, maybe you paid off the mortgage on that. But what have you actually got in your savings? You might be then still living week to week, saving up for your retirement. Unless you sell down, move to a downsize and unlock all that capital or equity, or move to a less affluent area or a less nicer home to actually realize that. But if you're staying in that home that you have, you can't do anything with that home. I guess unless he's talking about property investing and using equity in your home, which a lot of people don't like to do because they just don't know the ins and outs of it. It's only going to be for those savvy people that maybe they use a buyer's agent or try and do it themselves. And it's maybe going to be a bit hit or miss if you can do that, if you've got the time to do that, to look into it, or if you have that sort of risk appetite. But that's it. Like, yeah, we all can be millionaires via a home, but unless you sell and realize it and turn it into cash, doesn't really mean much.
And it ranked Australians' households as being the second wealthiest in the world in terms of median wealth. And that was just behind Luxembourg. But unlike other nations, Phil, Australians hold most of the wealth in their overpriced homes rather than financial assets. So, other nations that were in these rankings tend to hold more wealth in shares, in cash, that sort of thing. Australians are wealthy because we've got super expensive houses.
When I lived overseas, and this was in my late 20s, and I was working in Europe, and a lot of the European guys I was working with around my age, they were like, it's very rare to actually even own a home. Most of them are actually already at that stage in their countries that they'll be renting for the rest of your life, and it's super, super wealthy actually can afford a home in some of these European countries that on the wealthier side. So it's just the Australian dream is just going to have to be something else now for a lot of people. But overseas is actually par for the course. It's not that unusual to pay high taxes, and also to not even entertain the idea of owning a home at any point in your life. Even actually having a car is, if you go to the middle of London, you don't even really need a car, but it's for the super, super rich, super wealthy. Like, it's just at another level. And I think finally it's like the cat is out of the bag. The good run we've had with the lifestyle that our parents have had, it's going to be a bit different for the new generation.
And because of that, I'd argue that most of our wealth is actually fake. It's imaginary.
Yeah, right.
Because it's not it's not liquid, right? So whether or not your home's worth $500,000, $2 million, $5 million, whatever, it's just really somewhere to live, and you can't eat your house, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately,
Well, it's true. Like, if you're maybe lost your job, and maybe you have you still got to make those repayments, and maybe even if you've paid off your home, then you got to eat into your savings. You can't just say, "All right, I'm just going to sell my garage and unlock 100K." And then you can live off that. You got to sell the whole bloody thing, or you got to get into the property game and start investing. You almost don't have a choice. it's just the system. It's the way it is.
This massive amount of capital in the nation, which has just poured into the housing market over the last 30 years, is actually one of the things that's helping to wreck the nation's productivity. It's certainly not the only thing, but Australia's banks have become massively focused on mortgage lending at the expense of lending to businesses. So, just by way of comparison, in 1990, roughly 2/3 of bank lending was to businesses, whereas if he's 35 years later, in 2025, the ratio is completely flipped, and now 2/3 of bank lending is for housing, and barely 1/3 of businesses. And in Australia,
Mate, who would want to run a business, a small business, or even start a small business? You're better off. The banks would want you to is, be hold an investment portfolio and take on that risk. It's and you probably notice that at the moment is like all these spruikers of buyers agents saying this is how you get rich now is just through property.
5 of the 10 most valuable companies on the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX, are banks. So you got the Big Four and Macquarie Bank. And whereas if you compare that to America, which is the most productive economy in the advanced world at the moment, America's share market is dominated by tech companies, Nvidia, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, things like that. And productivity is booming in the US, whereas in Australia it's completely stagnant. Now, I'm not saying it's all because of the housing problem, but it's part of it. And it's kind of perverse that despite being amongst the wealthiest households in the world, Australians struggling so much financially. So they're obviously buckling under the weight of mortgage payments, rent payments. According to Cotality,
it's true. It's the big a big part of your pay going is towards either renting or paying off that mortgage. But it's also our expectations of what we're prepared to live in. We all don't have to live in the houses. We can always go a less attractive, less desirable location, or a home that doesn't have all the mod cons, just to keep those costs down. And I think that's what's going to start happening is what our expectations are going to start changing. You can whinge and complain all you want, but at the end of the day, when there's no more money in your bank account, you're going to have to make that decision.
Formerly CoreLogic, both mortgage payments and rent payments were sucking up a record share of our incomes at the end of 2024.
When I moved to the UK in my 20s, it was very well known before you went over. People were like, "Oh, you'll have fun, but it is expensive," and I had no idea. I went over on the same equal wage that I had in Australia, and it was back then. It was like, or easily a third of your wage would just go to rent, and what you could rent was you got nothing. It's very common to share. Be in share accommodation, especially in your 20s, in the UK. So it's just, this is already in other parts of the world with bigger populations. Things cost more on, like in the UK, on the pounds, and in the States, USD, in the big cities. Like you go to New York, it's the same thing. There's like limited space, but everyone wants to live there. Why is there millions of people living in New York? They don't have to live there. So it's just going to be that realization of what so many of us had it really good for a very long time, especially those the baby boomers are laughing. It's so good for them.
And, given that housing affordability is at such a dire state, young people can't afford to buy homes, they're struggling to rent, it's pretty rich to sort of think that, young people obviously need their parents to help them out to try and buy a home. It's kind of a bit perverse to think that we've got the second wealthiest households. And
it's so good to listen to a guy like Leith. He is someone who is saying what we're all thinking. We're all thinking this, but we're not the experts. We're not economists. But this guy, this is what he does for a living. And he just comes across as to how we're all feeling right now.
Really, Australians would be wealthier if the average home was worth 500,000 instead of over a million. And we had, household debt to income was 9.
I'll tell you what, I would prefer that too. I'd rather have, instead of $1 million home, I'd rather have a $500,000 home and $500,000 in savings. That would be amazing.
20% instead of 180%, which it is at the moment. And, just by way of counterpoint, in 1991, Australia's home ownership rate was 5% higher than it is today. Homes cost 3 times incomes versus 8 times incomes today. And household debt was 70% of income versus 180% of income today. And banks, as I said before, lent 2/3 of businesses, only 1/4 of mortgages. So they mostly lent to businesses. And, based on that, objectively, households are far better off in 1991 than they are today, yet they're now the second most richest households in the world, apparently. Right. And also, I'd argue the Australian economy was far more diversified in 1991 than it is today. We're basically just a houses and holes economy now. So this is a long way to get around to the fact that Australia's expensive housing is basically a gross misallocation of capital. It's wrecking our productivity, or it's harming our productivity. It's obviously, harming, like, housing affordability is terrible in this country. And really the last thing you want to do when you have homes that are valued at $1,020,000 on average is to pour more petrol on the housing bonfire. And unfortunately, that's exactly what the Albanese government has done. So during the election campaign, they announced that they were going to allow all first home buyers, effectively, to purchase a home with only a 5% deposit. And the taxpayer, i.e. the government, would basically guarantee 15% of all borrowers' loans. Now, this week, the government announced that policy is going to be brought forward to the 1st of October. So it's going to come in very shortly. And the Australian...
why bring it forward? It's like this urgency of just to keep it going up. Well, guys, halfway through the video, I'm trying to grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. So it'd really help me out if you like this sort of content, to keep subscribe and be notified when I upload a new video.
Treasury predicts that this policy, that 70,000 homes will be purchased by first home buyers in the first year of the scheme. And obviously, if you're going to bring in all these extra people who can borrow with a 5% deposit, and you're going to basically guarantee 15% of homes, you're going to increase demand for housing, and you're going to put upward pressure on prices. We've seen the past 25 years, when the government's done first home buyer grants, done any kind of subsidies, etc., under the name of affordability. Every time that's happened, it's basically led to bigger mortgages and higher home prices. So these policies always get capitalised into higher home prices, and they're ultimately self-defeating from an affordability perspective. In the end, you just end up with more expensive housing than you would have had otherwise, and people carrying more debt than they would have had otherwise. And in this case, taxpayers are going to be on the hook for 15% of these mortgages, which means that if there ever is a housing crash in the future, I'm not saying there will be one, but if there is, taxpayers will be on the hook, and then the government will be incentivised to then fire hose more taxpayer money at the housing market to blow house prices even higher to avoid having to take those losses. So modelling that was released by Lateral Economics this week concluded that this 5% deposit scheme alone could increase house prices by between 3.5% and 6.6% nationally within the first year. So that's across all homes. And for the properties that first home buyers are most likely to buy, so those are sort of your slightly more affordable properties because they tend to not be able to buy the expensive ones. This modelling suggested that prices could rise by just under 10% within 12 months as a result of this policy. So, again, when you've got the average home in Australia is valued at $1,020,000, the last thing the market needs is for the federal government to be pouring more policy stimulus on the housing bonfire and making homes even more expensive, which is going to be the ultimate result. And then, having people taking on even more household debt or even more mortgage debt to be able to buy these homes with lower deposits. Because ultimately, you're just going to end up with more expensive housing. This is exactly what's happened for the last 25 years with all these sorts of policies. It's never made housing more expensive. It's never boosted housing supply. It just ends up pushing up prices, pushing up debt. It means the banking system becomes more warped, just lending to mortgages rather than to businesses. Ultimately, it distorts the economy, which is what we've had. And ultimately, it's going to be, destructive from a productivity perspective. And if the Albanese government genuinely wanted to improve housing affordability, it should have taken the pressure off rents and house prices by lowering immigration. Right? So, Alan Kohler wrote from the ABC, wrote earlier in the week that the number of net overseas migrants that's landed since the Albanese government was elected, since the pandemic, was around 800,000 more than the Australian Treasury projected in its budget. So we've got 800,000 more people have come in that require housing, that require rental housing, which is one of the reasons why rents have gone up on average by about $10,000 the median rent is $10,000 roughly, or just over $10,000 more across the country than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've got, hundreds of thousands of extra people have come in, more than the government ever expected, who need rental properties. And that's also putting upward pressure on prices. So if the government really want to take the pressure off the housing market, both rents and prices, and wanted to make housing more affordable, it should cut immigration. And it should cut it quite hard, because demand through immigration has run well ahead of supply for years, and it's going to continue to run ahead of supply. And the federal government...
Look, if that's the case, and it's not trying to be racist or anything, it's more just sustainability. Trying to sustain where we're at, just cool things for a bit. If that is the case, like Leith saying that if we just cool that for a bit, just let things stabilize for a bit. But it just seems like everything the government's doing is just this parabolic, just like sending it through the roof. And what's going to happen? It's just still going to come crashing down one way or the other. It's just the way the cycles work. Things suddenly go crazy, and then what's on the other side of it? It's gonna top at some point and have to pull back.
Government's own advisory council, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, forecasts that over the next 5 years, Australia's housing shortage is going to worsen by 79,000 homes, because the number of people coming in through immigration is going to exceed the number of homes that will be built. Yet the same analysis in their sensitivity analysis said if we just reduce population growth by 15%, so we still grow quite strongly, but we just reduce population growth by 15%, instead of having a 79,000 shortage of homes, we have a 40,000 surplus. So that tells you that the solution here is to lower the demand by lowering immigration and lowering this population pressure. It takes the pressure off rents, takes the pressure off prices. That's what they should do. Unfortunately, Phil, the Albanese government's taken the opposite approach. They've actually expanded the intake for international students by another 25,000, and they've also watered down English language standards for migrants. And what that means is we're more likely to get higher migration going forward, not less. And as a result, the population demand is going to continue to run ahead of supply, which means that we're just going to have this worsening overall affordability, this structural housing shortage. So unfortunately, this 5% deposit scheme is just a policy band-aid. It's going to make the situation worse when the solution is staring the government in the face. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, which is the federal government's own advisory council, says in black and white that Australia cannot build enough homes for the number of people that are coming through migration. And the solution, according to its own sensitivity analysis, is to cut immigration. Because if you do that, you'll actually create a surplus of homes, and you'll take the pressure off rents, and you'll lower prices, other things equal. So It's just more of the same, unfortunately, Phil. We've seen this stuff for 25 years. Poor policy from federal government. Just keep pouring more fuel on the housing bonfire, and instead of letting prices drift lower and become more affordable, or instead of allowing rents to become more affordable, they just keep making both more expensive and actually making the housing affordability situation even worse in Australia.
Well, who does it benefit? That's what you got to think right now. The way things are going, there's definitely winners. But when it gets to the point where there's more losers, there's going to be unrest. All right, post your comments, guys. What do you think about this? Just madness.